The title of our presentation is Discourses of Change, Decolonization and Anti-Ableism in Music Programs. We would like to start with a positionality statement to acknowledge that this work is informed by our own lived experiences. We are both white settler women with European backgrounds who have studied music in Canada for several years. The institution at which we currently study and teach, the Desautels Faculty of Music at the University of Manitoba, has especially informed this project. I grew up studying clarinet in the school band system in Saskatchewan. I have studied and/or taught at 5 different universities in Canada, all of which had curricula patterned quite closely on the conservatory model, with York University being a distinct outlier. In my professional life in Manitoba since 2011, first at Brandon University and now at the University of Manitoba, I can see the results of the conservatory model's long history and dominant influence on music training in this province.
I grew up studying voice, piano, and music theory within the Royal Conservatory framework. I was a voice teacher and music director for the United States Army between 2009 and 2015, and have noticed strong and troubling similarities between the Army approach to soldier and family wellness during wartime and the current conservatory approach to music student wellness. I studied education at the University of Winnipeg and have a BMUS from the University of Manitoba. I'm currently working on an MA in music research at the U of M.
In 2019, Dylan Robinson's letter titled "To All Who Should Be Concerned" was published in a themed issue of Intersections on Decolonizing Music Pedagogies, edited by Robin Addis and Margaret Walker. This letter describes some of the structural changes that must be implemented by music programs in order to move toward decolonial forms of higher music education. Even before this letter was published, several music academics, myself included, had been motivated to make decolonial changes in our institutions, curricula, and classrooms. We have since continued to grapple with these issues with our faculty colleagues and students, with some triumphs and several frustrations. However, starting in March 2020, challenges equal to that of decolonizing a music faculty moved to the foreground for me when it became clear that we were all expected to essentially continue work and study more or less as per usual during a global pandemic that placed an extreme amount of stress on the physical and mental health of everyone around us, students, staff, and faculty members alike. This nearly impossible situation not only highlighted how unhealthy and ableist our music school was, but also gave us an opportunity to consider alternative ways of doing things.
Critiques of conservatory model music schools, like the one at which we study and work, predate the pandemic. A substantial body of scholarly literature has connected the traditional Western European music conservatory training model to significant physical and psychological health challenges for music students. These studies uncover an inherently ableist system that emphasizes competition, hierarchies, and virtuosic performance. For example, Udy and Littleton and Davies discuss the conservatory as a competitive space where learning opportunities are not equally available to all students. Demir Batir in 2015 describes the conservatory environment as a stressful place because of high competition, isolation, failure to achieve career goals, authoritarian teaching style, and intolerance against errors caused by stress, anxiety, and financial uncertainty. Many conservatory-style music faculties in Canada and elsewhere have created student wellness support, such as yoga and mindfulness workshops, to help students develop resilience against the potentially damaging effects of music training. However, these additive strategies do not address fundamental issues inherent in ableist conservatory pedagogical models. In fact, wellness supports, like accommodations culture, articulate individual students as the problem rather than considering how the system itself may be flawed.
How can we address this critique of the conservatory within the current EDI discourse, as it is known at the University of Manitoba? Underlying this question is my own uneasy relationship with the umbrella concept of EDI. On the one hand, with this model, justice and equity seem to now be prioritized at our institution to a degree I have never witnessed, and bringing all the discourses of difference under one umbrella, including racial differences, differences in sexuality and gender, in disability, and other aspects. This seems to strengthen everyone. On the other hand, in practice, the EDI umbrella arrangement is vulnerable to pitfalls, some of which I want to briefly mention. The first is a flattening of difference. For example, when we address all non-white groups as if they were homogeneous, foregrounding racial difference, but obscuring other differences, such as the Indigenous identity as survivors of colonial violence. The second is the tendency to replicate hierarchies of power, often privileging those who are visibly different over invisible differences. Finally, and most pertinent to our project, the EDI umbrella, at least as it has been administered at the U of M, does not easily lend itself to intersectional approaches. Working to create transformational strategies that address more than one of the discourses of difference simultaneously, or developing an intersectional methodology, is not an easy task, but we aim to at least start a conversation today about ableism and the colonial roots of many music programs in Canada.
We will first briefly discuss the connections between colonialism and ableism in higher education generally, followed by a consideration of the conservatory model and its own colonial and ableist characteristics. We will then compare decolonization strategies as outlined by Dylan Robinson with anti-ableist pedagogical models, namely universal design for learning, aiming to identify intrinsic parallels and resonances between the two.
A note about terminology before we continue. First, we acknowledge the problem pointed out by Tuck and Yang in using the terms decolonize and decolonization when not associated with the repatriation of Indigenous land and life. In this paper, we have conceded to use decolonial and anti-colonial interchangeably only because it mirrors how our own institution uses this terminology, but we do acknowledge its limitations. What we mean by decolonization in the academic context is decentering Western practices or approaches and Western ways of knowing in courses and curriculum. Beyond paying attention to what and how we are engaging in music study and teaching, we also pay attention to who is teaching whom and where we are teaching and studying. We take the definition of ableism from Fiona Campbell, who stated that the concept of ableism is closely linked to the cultural lens of disability studies. It is defined as, quote, a network of beliefs, processes, and practices that produces a particular kind of self and body, the corporeal standard, that is projected as the perfect, species-typical, and therefore essential and fully human. Disability then is cast as a diminished state of being human, end quote.
Recent studies by disability scholars and Indigenous scholars have suggested deep connections between colonialism and ableism. Indigenous peoples and disabled peoples are both marginalized by deeply overlapping and mutual reinforcing mechanisms of oppression. One place these mechanisms operate is in higher education. According to disability studies scholar Jay Domage and Indigenous scholar Nicole Nash, who both agree on that. Domage asserts that university campuses have a long history of exclusion that manifested itself in both the residential school system for Indigenous peoples and psychiatric institutions for disabled people. Denise Nash states that schools remain spaces that are hostile to individuals who think, move, speak, or act in ways that divert from the ideal student. Parallel to Campbell's definition of ableism as a network that produces a perfect species-typical corporeal standard, Denise Nash speaks about colonial culture that asserts itself as the dominant, the normative, the objective. UK disability scholar Nicole Brown notes that applying neoliberalism to higher education has produced the concept of the perfect academic and has made all of us into productivity machines. She states the premise for such a rigid regime of productivity, effectiveness, and excellence geared towards tangible outcomes and outputs in order to support the prestige economy of a university is a standard, normative, fully able, and abled being. In brief, ableism in academia is endemic. If higher education broadly can be characterized as both colonial and ableist, it follows that the conservatory model, which is still commonly used to structure music study in higher education, is also likely to be colonial and ableist. Let's take a closer look at the ways in which this model operates.
Conservatory model training for musicians emerged from Western European medieval church choir schools. While conservatories are generally thought to have originated in Italy, their structure is essentially a pan-European phenomenon. Characteristics of today's conservatory-style programs are similar to the conservatories developed in the 18th and 19th centuries. This model was brought to Canada primarily by European-trained British and French musicians and music teachers as part of the colonial project, with the goal of replicating not only Western European art music training models, but also replicating elite Western European music culture. The Paris Conservatoire was internationally renowned in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and as such, is one of the most important models for modern conservatories. This institution was established in 1795 in conjunction with the new French Republic, and its history is well documented. The Conservatoire, essentially a politically connected trade school, was an important driver of cultural colonialism. It functioned as both a symbol of French culture and a tool with which France could create an international reputation. According to Kern Holloman, the Conservatoire was the ultimate gateway to a career in music in France in the 19th century. She states, a premier prix from the Conservatoire launched careers in the best theaters and concert societies. The foremost instrumentalists rose to occupy simultaneously principal chairs at the Opéra and Société des Concerts du Conservatoire, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, and a professorship at the school. Its graduates staffed major theaters, on stage and in the pit, served as consultants and participants in the development and manufacture of modern orchestral instruments, and composed the competition solos and wrote the method books that served music pedagogy all over the world for much of the 19th and 20th centuries.
The Paris Conservatoire curriculum had three major categories: singing, playing, and composing. All students took classes in sight singing and sight reading, while singers took supplemental training in diction, posture, and carriage. The roster of instrument teachers was exalted, fostering astonishing lineage. All students participated in ensembles, which engaged in rigorous canon formation, but also performed works by composition students. Classes in harmony and counterpoint were important prerequisites to composition study. In the late 19th century, historical studies were added, primarily focusing on early music. The academic year centered around jury-assessed competitions, many of which were open to the public, providing students their first exposure to public performance. According to Holloman, students were admitted by competitive audition and remained at the conservatoire until they left with a prize or were dropped from the roll. Conservatory-style programs in higher education today are marked by similar characteristics. And all or the majority of credits are music courses. Their core curriculum includes apprenticeship model music lessons with assessment by jury, ensemble requirements, musicianship classes, which include a variety of skills such as sight singing, keyboard, oral dictation, etc., and academic classes in theory and history only insofar as they serve the goal of performance and composition. In this model, music theory is valued for skills in harmony and counterpoint and other techniques to assist a performer or composer in their craft. So-called history courses are valued for teaching about masterwork repertoire and period style characteristics. Academic music classes that consider music from a humanities or social science approach are not a part of the conservatory framework. Music education curricula is considered at least partly outside of the conservatory model, if not mostly. But the makeup of these programs generally reflects provincial school systems music programs, which may in themselves replicate the conservatory model for younger students. In the conservatory model, a music school is not wholly an academic faculty or part of one, but a professional school that trains performers, composers, and conductors for direct entry into the Western European classical music industry. Many jazz programs in universities today are also modeled on the European conservatory structure. So while this model originated with Western European art music, it is not limited to that repertoire.
Let's go back to the literature mentioned at the beginning of this talk to discuss the most prominent ableist critiques of the conservatory model. The physical and psychological challenges cited most often by students is elevated stress and anxiety exacerbated by competition, hierarchies, and the focus on virtuosity. Related issues are intolerance against errors, authoritarian teaching styles, isolation, learning opportunities not equally available to all, and the typically heavy workload involved in a degree that normally exceeds the campus credit unit average and also may include zero or low credit required activities. Let's first look at Robinson's points about decolonizing the music school, followed by the basic principles for the concept of universal design for learning.
As you can see on the slide, we've simplified Robinson's points as follows. Abolish the current configuration of entrance requirements, reevaluate student recruitment and the dominance of Western music in curriculum, diversify faculty, acknowledge diverse epistemologies of music, diversify pedagogical practices, not always relying on Western methods, assess your program's connection to different communities, unpack the normative structure of your curriculum, and share openly in various platforms the changes implemented and their results. The purpose of universal design is to create products or processes to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need of adaptation or specialized design. These principles can then be adapted to learning. The basic principles in universal design are as follows: equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, size and space for approach and use.
The challenge, of course, is that we are comparing apples and oranges. Robinson has already considered anti-colonial principles and applied them to the music school. But we have to adapt general universal design principles to learning, then to the music school. Those of us who are classroom teachers may already be familiar with universal design concepts as applied to learning as follows: presenting information and ideas to students in multiple ways, encouraging students to engage in course activities in different ways, and providing students with flexible options to demonstrate learning. Excuse me. These UDL concepts are parallel with many of Robinson's suggestions. For example, diversifying pedagogical methods and exploring practices outside Western methods, but they also allow more flexibility to diversify in different ways, such as unpacking the normative structures of curriculum and acknowledging diverse epistemologies of music. Students are ultimately given more flexibility in their learning. How might these principles be applied to learning in studios, rehearsal halls, and other spaces?
Applied lessons students can be given more latitude in choosing their own repertoire. Although the one-on-one instructional method has been considered the gold standard in performance teaching, small group lessons might carry benefits for some students, especially if they feel more confident learning with their peers. Students might be given options in performance assessment that do not involve a live performance in front of a jury of professors. Perhaps the option to be graded by their applied teacher alone or submitting a recording, for example, would be better for them. Hierarchies created by chair auditions have been abolished in some ensembles, where directors assign different chair parts for each piece, giving all students the opportunity to play different roles in the ensemble setting. We might also consider that ensembles are not for everyone and allow students to opt out of this activity, especially if their instrument does not easily fit into an ensemble setting. Consider the implicit inequity in the musicianship classroom, where pianists who don't have to navigate concert pitch and who have been playing and listening to chordal harmony for years hold the most privilege, and the student who plays a transposing instrument that normally sounds one pitch at a time is at a distinct disadvantage. These classes can present an especially anxiety-inducing experience for many.
Most of the changes discussed above are reliant on individual professors, altering their practices in their classrooms, studios, and rehearsal halls. Organizational analyst William Fleming states that more emphasis must be placed on organizational change and not change at the individual level. We need to think of our music schools as ecosystems in which one professor's changes can be amplified or canceled out by the actions of others, creating the illusion of care. To effectively change a school's ableist culture, we need to address together broader program issues like entrance requirements or number of credit units and degrees, and examine potentially damaging practices vis-a-vis anxiety-provoking competitions and the glorification of technical virtuosity over all other values. As stated at the outset, this project reflects our experiences at our own institution, and we look forward to hearing about your experiences. Thank you for listening.